Well, I'll kick us off here at the top. I don't have a whole lot to say to kick this meeting off. Just wanted to welcome everyone to the second stakeholder meeting for the rooftop solar potential study. It's been about a month since we had the first meeting, the kickoff meeting, and we're back here today with a pretty full agenda that Jeremy will talk through in just a minute. But hopefully you all received a document I sent last week that contains some of the model inputs that are features of the DGen, the NREL DGen model that's being used for this study. And if you've had a chance to look those over and come to this meeting with questions and ideas, that's what we're here for, and we look forward to that. So once again, welcome, and I'm just going to hand it right over to the Cadmus team and Jeremy Eckstein.
Great. Thank you, Mitch. So webinar logistics and guidelines, same as for all of our other meetings. Please keep yourself muted. If you have questions, please either unmute yourself and ask them during the question and answer stops, or add them to the chat. And we'll proceed as we have for all of our previous meetings. Our agenda today is to cover first some of the model inputs and assumptions that we're using with the NREL DGen model. So we'll be looking at our cost, performance, financing, incentive, and ICT assumptions, and we'll look at those separately. Then we're going to look at our approach for modeling income qualified potential and multifamily potential. And then lastly, we'll talk through some of the proposed economic scenarios that we are considering and that we're looking for your feedback on. Okay. So I'll jump right into the model inputs and assumptions. So first, one of the important financial elements to the model are the costs of the actual installations. And so for the costs, we're looking at both the upfront capital expense, and then the ongoing operations and maintenance costs. And so for the capital expenses, we're actually using a starting point from the Focus on Energy program data. So we did have access to that, and we're able to calculate a dollar per kW system size. And then to look at the cost changes over time, we're applying a trajectory from the NREL Annual Technology Baseline Study, and that shows the changes over time. I would also say that we compared the capital expenses to a couple of other sources, including Lazard's and Energy Sage, and the commercial costs line up pretty closely, although the residential costs are slightly higher compared to some of the other sources. But again, these are based on actual costs from the Focus on Energy program. For the operations and maintenance costs, we're using the ATB study. And apology for the way that the graph looks. It's Teams has pulled it in a kind of interesting way there. So that's our costs. We also need to look at performance, and in particular, one of the metrics is that we're looking at is the power density. So we need a kind of a maximum power output for the installations by square foot, since we're essentially estimating the technical potential by the available rooftop square footage. And so to get the power density that we're showing here, we also looked at focus on energy program data, and we looked at actually researched the various models that are presented in the data, and found kind of the rated power output for those panels, and then extrapolated the power output efficiency increases over time using the International Technology Roadmap. And the degradation factor is 0.5%. That was a standard model input, and that aligns with what we frequently see elsewhere. For project financing, so these are all inputs that came from the NREL ATB study in 2020. So we're looking at, based on that study, a 30-year project lifetime, 30-year loan term, and interest rate of 4%, and discount rate of 4.2%. The down payment fractions also from that study are 40% for residential and 26% for commercial. And all of these metrics are important for calculating project payback over time. We did receive a question of how we are looking at the electric price changes. These are sourced from the Energy Information Administration's annual energy outlook. So they're not based on inflation.
Hey, Jeremy, this is Mitch. Can I ask a question real quick or just make a clarifying point?
Please.
And I just want to make sure that everyone kind of knows what you're reviewing here and why. So can you confirm that these are what you're looking at as baseline input assumptions? Just kind of, I don't know how you'd characterize that, but just a baseline type of a condition. Is that right?
That's right.
And so if folks have feedback to say, and you're documenting the sources of where you're getting this information. So as we go along here, I just want everyone to kind of understand this is kind of baseline model inputs that Jeremy's reviewing, and if folks say that doesn't look right or that seems off to me, please feel free to jump in.
Absolutely. We're looking for feedback on these assumptions. So for some of the model inputs, we obviously readily had access to better information, like with the focus on energy research, program research that we did. For some of these other ones, we're relying on the NREL data. So if folks have feedback, say, for example, on the loan interest rates, or down payment fractions or whatever metrics, we're very happy to take that if there's more Wisconsin specific information that we should consider. I'll also note that there are a couple of these metrics that we're actually proposing to vary for either a low income scenario or an overall economic scenario. So these are adjustable variables.
Hey, Jeremy, this is Mike from HGA. Could I throw a question in here?
Sure.
If you go back to the pricing for the initial slide, I think for dollars per kW, how does we deal mostly in the commercial side of things. I can't really speak to residential, but we're seeing projects that are competitively bid come back at like $1,500 per kW and quite significantly reduced from where you guys are at. Could you just talk to how system size affects your model, and like what size system are you guys looking at for commercial, and I'd also be interested to hear from Scott about the pricing through the focus program. And I know like when it was recip, a lot of those projects weren't really competitively bid out. And I'm curious to see how recent those numbers are because I don't know, it seems high to me for the commercial side.
Great. So I'll talk a bit and then I'll let Scott also talk. So the model doesn't vary the capital price by system size, and the system size will be essentially optimized based on the NREL model to maximize the payback, and also will be constrained by the available rooftop area. So this is not a dynamic model variable, if you will.
So that optimization, is that like for individual roofs, or how does that work?
Yeah, it's for an individual customer.
Okay. So if the ROI if it's like always above the life of the system or whatever, 30 years, then it decides not to build a system there, basically.
Will
I,
it decide? Sorry,
sorry,
go ahead.
I could rephrase that. So let's say you have the model will look at a roof area and determine, okay, based on the utility tariffs in this area, the payback for X size system is this, and then it would decide whether or not it'd be feasible to put a system there, or how does that work?
It's a pretty complicated modeling algorithm, and there's another chart that I'll show you that's probably going to explain it, but it's essentially a combination of economic attractiveness, kind of a maximum market diffusion curve, and also diffusion variables. But the way that the system is sized will be to optimize payback. And if there's going to be no then the adoption will depend on like what the payback is, if that helps.
Yeah. So I'm kind of getting a bit ahead of you guys here, so I apologize for that. But the system cost, will there be a scenario run that varies the system cost curves, or?
Yes. Well, we're proposing it.
Okay.
And we'll get to that at the end. Like,
Sure.
but we have discussed that costs are a really important financial input, and so one of the economic scenarios that we're going to propose is using different cost assumptions.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a great idea because most of our commercial systems are over 100 kW, and we haven't seen that 225, which is kind of where the commercial curve is at. We haven't seen that for many years. So I think that would be worthwhile.
Great.
Yeah, and this is Scott with Focus, and I can confirm. Yeah, this is based on that 2020 mark is all in every non-residential system, but the 1 to 10 kW range is almost $3 a watt, whereas over 500 kW is closer to $1.50. So that's I think everybody kind of knows that anecdotally, but yeah, can confirm that's in our data.
Okay, yeah, that's good to hear the affirmation there, because yeah, it just didn't seem quite right, but it is so dependent on system size.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks.
This is Scott Blankman from Clean, Wisconsin. I just had one question. There was a reference to, I thought it was energy costs coming from EIA on maybe the previous slide or the slide prior to that. And I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to, when you talk about energy cost, is that what the assumption is as far as what electricity rates in Wisconsin will go up by, or what's the underlying factors going into that assumption?
Right, that's for the electric rates. So
one of the
whether
things
or
that,
not they go up or decrease potentially.
okay. So one of the things that maybe could be helpful, as we think about scenarios and trying to understand the sensitivity to, utility rates, is to go back and actually compute what we've seen for the last 5 to 10 years in Wisconsin for average rate increases. And then I also know that some utilities have actually communicated to investors that they're targeting, rate increases of 1 to 2% per year. So it might be helpful to just kind of triangulate how that EIA data matches up with Wisconsin specific data, to the extent that has the ability to influence the output or the underlying results from the modeling.
Got it. I think we can do that. I saw a chat pop up. Is it whoever chatted? Do you want to just make your comment, or should we wait till later?
Yeah, it's Kathy. I was just, given what Scott B said about costs of systems based on size, I'm just wondering if it wouldn't be prudent to go back to those focused costs and look at a weighted average there versus a straight up average, to make sure that that cost in the primary scenario is maybe a little bit closer to market realities. I appreciate that there can be alternative scenarios, but those end up at the back of the report and they aren't the headline. And so I'd like to get this cost in the primary scenario as accurate as possible somehow.
Thank you. We looked at this. One of the other financial inputs is the ITC, the federal ITC credits. So these are based on the most recent extension that went into place in 2021. So we'll use these as a baseline, and then one of our scenarios will be to look at additional extension of the credits. Another important financial input is whatever the net metering or net billing policies in Wisconsin are. So we went in and reviewed the assumptions that were provided to us by NREL, and we made adjustments based on some additional research that we conducted into the tariffs for the different utility areas. And so these are the baseline scenarios that we're running. We had made one adjustment for Madison Gas and Electric to change it to a net metering policy, given that there's essentially banking of credits that's allowed, that makes it more of a net, it in fact turns it into a de facto net metering policy. And then the other utilities are primarily net billing, with the exception of Excel. And then for all other utilities that aren't the bigger IOUs listed, we're assuming a net metering policy. We don't have any sunset years for these policies in our system, in our baseline input, and then there's various capacity limits that also apply to residential and commercial customers.
I had a quick
This is-
question. Oh,
Please
this
go ahead.
This is Tyler Hebner. You mentioned the scenario related to tax credit extension. Are you considering a scenario that changes this in any way? Like, you know, if the capacity for net metering was increased, what would be the impact on the potential?
We're not currently considering or proposing a net metering scenario. And Mitch, you might want to address that further, since we talked about it a bit.
Well, I think anything's kind of on the table in terms of what folks think is of a high importance and value out of this study. I think that the model has some limitations in what it can and cannot do that I'm not an expert on in any way, and I know there's a fair amount of uncertainty with this particular aspect. So I wouldn't say that it's something we couldn't explore. It's more just kind of determining what the you know, we're limited in this. This is a study that's wrapping up in a couple months and can do as many as 4 economic scenarios. So we want to just make sure we're just capturing a valuable analysis here, which if folks have input there, we can talk through that.
I guess just one corollary to that would be, you guys are reporting out the results by at least the major utilities. Is that correct?
That's right.
Yeah, and so I don't know, yeah, maybe the first blush would be seeing the results, given that you've got 3 different levels for net metering for the larger commercial systems, a 20, a 300, and 100, and then kind of seeing, you know, how does that change utility by utility, what we're seeing. That may be one first way to get a sense of what those policy changes could mean. Is that possible, do you think, once the analysis is done?
Yes, absolutely. Because we will be reporting these out by, as you said, by the utility area, and then you could compare the. I mean, there will be other, I would say, potential impacts, utility by utility. So it may not be completely isolated to the capacity, but you should be able to compare them, put them next to each other, and see if there are differences that can be isolated. Is there any further questions on this slide?
I see a hand up. Is that Scott?
Yeah, this is Scott Blankman, Clean, Wisconsin. I guess, you know, maybe to circle back and emphasize Tyler's point about, you know, understanding the usefulness of the information. I believe that the utilities are going to be coming in around September 1st with some of their parallel generation sort of compensation rates, which would be an initial sort of read on, you know, where utilities might be trying to go, you know, with some of their proposed rates. And then also I know that commission staff is in the process of looking at some of the net metering sort of elements. And I'm curious how those parallel analyses are being considered or can be considered in the release of this report on a go-forward basis, so that, you know, it's useful, you know, based off of what expectations currently are. Kind of, it seems like we would have a historical perspective, but then there might be some more current information that might provide an additional reference point, and how could the report incorporate any of those sort of real-time changes?
Yeah, Mitch, this is Joe Fontaine. I can take a first swing at that if you want. You brought up two pieces in the docket. The TE dockets, I think, will focus more on the larger systems above the maximum capacity thresholds that we're talking about here. So I think, the way you generally phrased it, if it gives an idea of where people are going with this, definitely has some truth to it. And that's something that we can be in touch on. The net metering work is underway, but I think, finishing things for public release is definitely not imminent on that yet. So I'm in touch with Mitch and the other staff on this on a regular basis, so we're kind of trading information step by step as we go through it. I think the way the timing is going to work out here with the relatively short time frame of this study, that we will not have pretty definitive answers out of the 157 docket on the time frame of this study. But it is something we can stay in touch about on a more day-to-day, week-to-week basis and make sure we're as aligned as we can be.
Thank you, Joe.
Great. So I'm going to move on to our maximum adoption curves. So the model it doesn't strictly base the diffusion on payback, but it's an important input into the model. And it's related to essentially what the model assumes about what can be a maximum market share or adoption based on payback period. So this is the NREL. This is essentially NREL research about the relationship between payback and what the overall market will bear. These are based on surveys that NREL has conducted. And essentially, it shows the adoption sensitivity to cost, or I should say payback, including all of the various financial considerations that go into making that determination. And so these are two kind of input curves that come with the model. We actually don't have a better source for these curves, but they show like I said, the sensitivity to costs for the residential and commercial sectors, and so what these show is essentially a much greater sensitivity to cost in the commercial sector versus the residential sector. And for our, and we'll get to this for our low income approach, but one of the things that we're considering doing is looking into whether or not any of these curves, or the residential curve, could be shifted to express a greater sensitivity to cost for residential income qualified customers. Another model input are the rebates that focus on energy offers. So we understand that the commercial rebates are tiered. The model doesn't have the ability to handle tiered incentives, so we're essentially taking the average for commercial, and currently the program offers a flat rebate of $500 per system. So that's what we'll include in the model. Unfortunately, there are some constraints with this model that don't allow us to like I said, do tiered incentives or vary incentives for rural customers. And one of the scenarios that we were proposing was to look at sensitivity of adoption to the rebates. So those were the main model inputs that we looked at. Did we have any further questions? Please go ahead.
This is Tyler Hebner again. Can you go back one slide there? And I'm with the Public Service Commission for those that don't know, but so the maximum incentive, so with residential that and commercial, I think those are the levels today. Is this another sort of choice? Maybe this is a question for Mitch as we look at up to 4 scenarios. Would this be another potential scenario that we would have to run, or pick? Maybe net metering's one, maybe tax credits one, maybe this is one that we could vary in a analysis to see what the change would be should the incentive. I'm particularly looking at the commercial, to see if that was higher. For an instance, 2 years ago, the cap was $500,000. And so that was changed dramatically at that time, but that doesn't mean that will stay that way forever. So just curious, is that one of our choices, Mitch? Or
Yeah, exactly, Tyler. I think this would be an interesting one to look at because, as you noted, these have changed over the years and could very well change in the future. And it would be interesting to understand their influence on adoption, especially if, in kind of a baseline scenario, you've got the ITC, if it's not extending, because we're not assuming it's extended. And does that help keep the market or, accelerate the market in any way? So I think it would be an informative thing from my perspective to understand how these incentives and varying them or increasing them is what I would propose to see what that impact is. Now, what that change in incentives is, that's something to figure out.
we need to figure that
as soon
out.
as a year ago, it was the residential was 3 times as high.
Right. Yep. No, I think that would be one to take offline, Mitch, and just some of the other conversations that we've had around, is renewables going to continue to be a standalone, or are they, between cost effectiveness and cost of acquisition of savings, in the same ballpark as everything else, and therefore they should just be managed as, another measure, another technology as we look ahead to the next quad. I think sort of removing artificial barriers so that we can see, where it fits among its comparable technology peers as you look ahead in the next quad. It seems to me that would be helpful. And I think doing some scenarios with different levels of incentive may help us get there. So, but we can talk about that more between now and then. So thanks.
Jeremy, this is Mike again from HGA Architects and Engineers. Could I throw one more question in here?
Please.
So I just wanted to close the loop on the commercial pricing for system costs. Kathy had made some comments, and I'm not sure if they got addressed, but could we get some more information about how the commercial average cost was calculated? Was that an average of all focused commercial projects, or was that weighted for system size?
That was a average across all the, essentially all the capacity, and all the costs, and with outliers taken out.
So do we think it would be more appropriate to weight that to get more of like a system weighted average cost? Just because, you're going to have a lot. you'll have a lot, some really large projects that'll probably drive that cost down if you look at the weighted cost based on system size.
So absolutely, we will look at the cost data again.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just think like if installers are going to see this report and they see those costs on those numbers, I think the report will lose credibility pretty quickly because it's just not consistent with what the prices are in the market these days.
Understood.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Kathy, I think you have your hand up.
I do. Back another slide to what's essentially in this model, the adoption curve. I'm wondering if it feels like we should have some. I'm curious how this compares to the adoption curves we've used in the energy efficiency study where it was. And I get this is, NREL's model and all of that. But of course, as soon as you said this is based on customer surveys, I got nervous about people predicting the future. And I'm just curious if you can now or at some point provide some information on how this looks compared to what we see on efficiency, particularly because we know there's a phenomenon with solar that people can see it. And so there's sort of that Prius effect that we don't have in the adoption of heat pump water heaters or something that your neighbors don't have any idea you did.
Understood. We can certainly look into it. I'm not sure that there's a exact comparison to the S curves that we used for the efficiency study. I think they're structured differently, but we can see if there's some way to make a comparison.
Kathy, is your point that the adoption is less aggressive than you think, or is more, less aggressive than you might think it could be in reality?
So kind of just looking at this graph with nothing else, I don't know that I have that opinion, but I'm nervous that it might be. I mean, and I think about how on the efficiency side, the Cadmus approach is to like think about what constrains adoption in terms of how fast can things happen. And one of the things that's unique about PV is we're not constrained by a replace on failure or anything else really. I mean, we've seen this phenomenon now where solar installers can go door to door in a neighborhood and sell dozens of systems in a day. That I'm just a little nervous that saying, well, we're going to predict adoption based solely on cost. So I'm nervous about what that adoption looks like. And I think for me, it is intuitive that commercial would have more conservative than residential, but beyond that, it's hard for me to tell what this is. And so that's why I was hoping Jeremy could slap it up next to some other technology that might help me see if this is really aggressive or not. And I get that that's a complicated request. That's, of course, why I throw it out there and don't have a clue how to do it myself.
Yeah, we'll look into it. We'll have to think about how to make the comparison between the EE-S curves and this, but we'll certainly give it a good attempt to make a comparison, Kathy. And then I just wanted to mention that cost is certainly important, but the model is essentially takes cost and also diffusion into consideration. So the kind of like the calibrated market diffusion variables are also a part of the modeling process. So there's essentially two Bass diffusion coefficients that account for things like how quickly a technology diffuses in a marketplace. So it's mixed, if that's helpful.
Thanks. Yes, it is.
May I move on, or
There's
are there
another
any
hand
further
up.
questions?
Sam has his hand up.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, please.
Hey, this is Sam from Renew Wisconsin. I was wondering if you could go back a couple slides to the project financing image. I just had a couple questions on that because I wasn't sure. So is this data from NREL? I just kind of want to know where it's coming from.
So this data is coming from NREL. It's coming from their annual technology baseline study.
Okay, and I'm kind of curious also, it says a 30-year loan term. Does that make all finance projects then, does that factor into the payback period? Does that make it a 30-year payback? And then question 2B, does that also factor into the adoption curve then as well?
I'll admit that you've stumped me with that one. I'll have to circle back on that metric.
Okay, thanks. I just want to make sure that, like, you know, so from what I understand, most of my experience with financing comes on the residential side, and most of the folks that we know that offer financing for residential systems typically don't do a 30-year loan term. So you know, that so first I just wanted to make that point, but second I just wanted to know that, you know, if all finance projects are going to be at that 30-year or are going to be factored into the adoption curve at a 30-year payback period, then I would have an issue with that part of it, if that made sense.
That makes sense. And I would also say if there's data available, you know, on a shorter loan term period or interest rate or any metric, we're really happy to take that into consideration and do any kind of adjustments to these variables.
Great, thanks.
So please send us if you have it. My email's on the end slide.
Actually, Jeremy, if you could just on that same point. So those are static, like you're not going to be changing these, like you're going to have to figure out what all these terms are and leave it like that for the whole mod, for every version of the model you run. Is that right? Like you won't be adjusting anything here. Is that right?
Well, and we'll get to it with our proposed scenarios. We were thinking that we may consider adjusting the down payment fraction based on previous discussions to see what impact that has. And for income qualified customers, we also thought that we might adjust the down payment fraction, and we'll get to that shortly, given various constraints that income qualified customers might have, as well as the discount rate. So, so these are the baseline inputs. We can vary some of them for the economic scenarios, and also we're considering essentially varying them for some of these for our income qualified analysis.
I do want to just add though, Scott, that, the ability to say model a distribution of financing, for example, is difficult because there's so many different knobs that can be kind of tweaked for this, and we've got a very short timeline as well. So there's going to have to be some kind of simplifications in assumptions that go into it. I don't know if that kind of gets at a bigger picture for your question or helps at all, but there is kind of a limit to how much can be adjusted.
Sure. Yeah, no, I get that. That totally makes sense. I think the long term, Sam was totally dead on though, that the residential, at least for sure, is probably a lot shorter because of what we know of some of the folks that do finance, some of the trade allies that finance, do their own financing. But also I know a lot of homeowners do like HELOCs, home equity lines of credit and things. And those are, I think, generally 15 years. So
and we're going to be talking to some of the stakeholders, and maybe they could help shed some light on, what they are seeing in the field as well. But definitely, I mean, we want to set these parameters at the most realistic, that we can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and I just want to echo what Amalia is saying, that we do want to use the right metrics for Wisconsin, and if anyone has information that can improve these, we really welcome that. Okay. So if it's all right, I'd like to cover our approach to income qualified potential. So our scope includes estimating potential for income qualified customers. And I'll just start by saying that the model currently does not treat income qualified populations differently from standard income populations. And we've discussed this with NREL, and there may be some tweaks that they make in the future, but as of now, it isn't built into the model. So we are looking at a way to make that adjustment specifically for this project. And first, this slide just essentially shows that 38% of residential customers qualify in the income qualified brackets based on the 80% state median income threshold. That's for focus tier 2 incentives, and that's the same threshold that we used in the energy efficiency study. So this essentially sets up the next slide, which is what I just said, that the DGen model doesn't treat income qualified customers specifically, but I think there's reason to believe that income qualified populations are more sensitive to cost, specifically for solar projects. And so we have several variables that we have already talked about that we want to consider adjusting for the income qualified population. And number one was this adoption maximum market share adoption curve that we showed earlier. So looking at potentially shifting that to show a greater sensitivity to cost. Another is to look at the essentially the discount rate, and there's already some research that suggests that low-income populations apply a higher discount rate for these types of financial considerations, and then also to increase the down payment, decrease the down payment fraction to reflect a lower access to capital. And so we're conducting interviews with a variety of stakeholders. And so one of our proposed questions include getting some feedback on how we might adjust some of these inputs. And so these were 3 inputs that we talked about. These are things that we can vary in the model, and discussion points for some of our stakeholders. We're also
Jeremy,
looking.
There's a hand.
before you go on, can you say a little bit more about who the stakeholders are for this?
So the stakeholders, we're looking at both in and out of state stakeholders. We're looking at and these are still, I think, under discussion. But what we proposed is kind of like advocacy organizations, installers, and then program administrators, both in and out of state.
So the why I'm asking about this is I'm thinking about the energy efficiency potential study where the stakeholders were all weatherization providers, and so focused on a particular segment of that income qualified, but not necessarily the 60 to 80% of median income, which might be the group that has. So mostly, I guess, and I'm not sure I have immediate thoughts on who these stakeholders would be, but maybe I would encourage everyone to think about if there are particular stakeholders to suggest you speak to, so we get a kind of range of perspectives on all of those income qualified households, not just a subset of the weatherization qualified households.
Got it. I think we're more than happy to take suggestions on folks to talk to.
Yeah, agreed. That's a really good point. A broad representation is what we're aiming for. I don't want to get it so narrow that the the responses are just not as valuable. So please, the folks that are involved in that area, feel free to email myself and Jeremy with suggestions. I think they are looking to have these discussions in the next, what, 3 or 4 weeks? Is that right, Jeremy?
That's right. So please do email us. Is it okay? Any further questions here, or can I move ahead to multifamily? Okay, hearing none. So first off, we took a look at the program data, and just a couple of observations about where focus programs are currently being incented for multifamily, and they're located primarily in the in the commercial track of the program, and then also make up a fairly small proportion of that market, and also to note that a pretty sizable percent of the projects are with new construction. And so we're of course interested in modeling multifamily potential, and the model currently treats multifamily as a like residential investment decision, and that's, of course, we talked about this prior, but we're not looking at multifamily as like a individual tenant or unit resident investment decision. We're looking at it as a kind of like building owner decision point. So we need to make some adjustments to how to model this. And so what we're proposing to do is to estimate the technical potential, which is solely based on the available rooftop square footage and some of the shading constraints that the model takes into consideration, and then essentially apply an adoption curve to that segment that comes out of the other building segments that are modeled, and that's one way to get around the constraint that we do have. As I mentioned, the model is currently set up to look at the decision points in a different way than what we believe how it would be made. So so that's essentially our proposal. Given the kind of slower uptake or lower uptake that we saw in the previous slide, we may want to look at a kind of a slower adoption rate based on our model outputs, but I think we'll have to evaluate the best curve when we get our model outputs. So any questions on the income qualified or multifamily approach? Because the next part of the presentation is about our proposed scenarios. Okay. So we in our scope includes 4 potential economic scenarios, and so we thought about what makes sense to propose and are looking for feedback. One of them is the federal investment tax credit, and an extension of that, since we understand that well, I think we all know it's a pretty big driver of adoption. So one proposed scenario includes an extension of 2 years for commercial and residential customers. Another one would be to increase focus incentives significantly, so by 200%, or if I think it was talked about circling back on what that might be, but essentially increasing the focus incentive significantly. And then another would be to change our technology costs to see what lower technology costs would do. So the NREL annual technology baseline actually has multiple cost scenarios. So we could look at the most aggressive cost reductions. And then finally, we had a lot of discussion about financing in our previous meeting. So we were proposing a scenario whereby we could look at what changing the down payment fraction could do. And that's more or less our 4 scenarios. We'd be happy to take feedback on those. I see a hand up. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Ann Wentz from WEC Energy Group. And if you could go back to the slide that has the federal tax incentive proposal on it, please. So my question here is, and I realize, this may get into the weeds with needing a tax expert opinion, but for income qualified customers, depending upon what the threshold level is in which they would be deducting the amount of taxes that they would have to pay, especially in light of a lot of the current government subsidies that are in place, would extending the ITC by 2 years really have that much of a benefit on this particular group of customers? again, I realize there may have to be some additional analysis done by somebody who's more of a tax expert and is familiar with people in different income brackets and the impact of, unemployment benefits, child tax credits, things like, those incentives going on right now, to see if that's actually an incentive for people in this group to adopt solar, or if extending it by 2 years is really more of an incentive for people who currently are adopters of solar.
I appreciate that point. I think I don't have an answer for you right
Sure.
now. And maybe there are people that are more in tune with kind of the financing aspects for low income populations, but we can certainly look at it. I will just note that there are some nuances of policy that we may be constrained with in our model. And so to the extent that it's possible to make some tweaks, we can do it. But it just depends on what's doable within the way that the model is programmed by NREL. But it's certainly a well taken point, and we can circle back on that.
Thank you.
Hey, Jeremy, this is Mike from HGA again. One scenario, I think I included this on the information I sent in by email before the meeting, but to look at a scenario for mostly it's applicable to commercial, where you exceed the net metering limit and you're selling power to the grid, and what that buyback cost is. Because I know, like in the PG docket, that's one thing that's being looked at, is how to value that capacity, and that could definitely change things. If you have if you value capacity, closer to cone, you're looking at close to 3.5 cents per kilowatt hour for just for the capacity value. So I think that would be a real interesting scenario to take a look at. Do you follow me there, Jeremy?
I think so. And I think we're going to circle back on potentially doing net metering adjustments or scenario. I would just say that there is some constraints in the model about including benefits beyond the electric rates. So like if there's like capacity values, the model may not be able to include those.
Yeah.
Well,
it could just be like a kilowatt. It could be converted to like a dollars per kilowatt hour or something like that. So what do you guys use in the model for buyback rates? How does that work in the model?
So the model sources the retail rates from essentially a database of utility rates, and then it gets the market rates for the net billing from an NREL database of market rates, and it essentially applies it, I think, by the wholesale market.
Okay.
So
it would be interesting to just confirm those that database with kind of what's going on right now with the tariffs, and I think that would be a real interesting scenario, because I know on the commercial side, a lot of our system sizes are constrained, just economics. We try not to, well, generally they're undersized because we try not to export too much to the grid. But if the whole capacity payment thing got straightened out, that would change that quite a bit. You start to see a lot more commercial systems and on the larger size too.
Got it. And yeah, I think it was you who mentioned looking at the rate changes, and so I made a note to look at those, and then we'll also look at the actual rates.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Was there any further questions about potential economic scenarios?
Yeah, Jeremy, it's Kathy. Just to kind of build on what Tyler said earlier and some of what Mike's saying, I think a scenario that gets at this, the constraints we have with the various kind of net metering, net billing scenarios of utilities. I mean, I can just speak to this as a local government who has on open dockets at the commission said there should be more consistency in this and it should be more renewable friendly. This is an active topic. So I think maybe we can have one less financial scenario and one scenario that really is more what if Wisconsin's grid were substantially more renewable friendly.
Got it.
So there would be certain parameters to define what was meant by that, I guess, that would have to be decided upon if that were a path that this group felt was worthy of one of the 4 economic scenarios. So
yeah, it would sort of be a version of this, and maybe it would be, local governments have advocated for a maximum capacity of 500 kW and a net metering scenario. So it might be that across all utility territories. What does that do to the potential? And it kind of gets to Mike's point about we're making systems smaller than they could be because we're trying to fit into the parameters that exist on the system right now. Part of what the potential study should help us understand is what could we be doing if we didn't have some of those constraints on what we were putting on roofs.
Kathy, would you also consider third-party ownership one of those questions as well?
Well, sure, I would love to consider third-party ownership. I'm not sure how that fits into the model at all, like where that fits into your scenarios. I certainly think it's a potential game changer, but so yes, I'd love for you to be able to illustrate that, but I think it's also critically important that we really understand what the rooftop potential in Wisconsin is with fewer constraints on those roofs. And partly I say that because, one of the questions I get as local government is, why are we putting solar on the O'Brien farm? Why aren't we putting that all on rooftops? I feel like this analysis might help us understand what's really available on rooftops, but only if it removes some of these constraints.
Okay. I think what we'll do is kind of circle back internally on a potential scenario and reach out to the group. Does that sound right, Mitch?
that sounds right. I want to make sure everyone with more knowledge on this than me has a chance to help kind of lay this out on what would be a valuable scenario to look at, because ultimately we're trading horses here a little bit for what's we've got 4 scenarios to work with on the economics. So I just want to make sure everyone who knows about this, like I said, better than I do, has had a chance to weigh in.
Hi, this is Ann again. If I could just offer a couple comments in response to what Kathy just said. I think there's a couple different factors that also come into play with raising the maximum capacity, and that would be for every customer. So we want to make sure that all customers, or all people that want to have access to rooftop solar, could have that access, including putting on a larger size system, if I'm understanding correctly with what you're saying, to not just have it constrained by, you know, the 20 or the 100 or, you know, what the other utilities have. And some of that is bracketed in individual tariffs for those utilities. So there's that piece to it. So utilities would then have to go through that process to alter the tariffs. But the other thing that I'm also thinking about that hasn't been raised here, and it may be out of scope, and that's also the storage piece to this. So, you know, not everybody's home is suited for solar, and especially for people that may want solar that don't necessarily want it. So there's storage components is another bucket or topic or economic scenario. And there's also community solar, which also may be something that's, you know, gives people that want access to rooftop solar a better opportunity to get that access if, you know, the costs are lower for the installation of community solar versus on a rooftop that may be, you know, in an older home, or the roof needs repair, and those, you know, those make ready costs, if you will, are higher, and then puts the cost out of reach for someone versus being able to participate in a community solar option. Thank you.
Got it. So the model does include technical constraints on rooftop solar, and those come from essentially both LiDAR data to account for shading and by other adjustment factors that NREL applies. And then in terms of community solar and storage, that's unfortunately not within the scope of this study, with its focus on rooftop solar. Did we have any other questions about our scenarios? What I've heard so far is that there's interest in a kind of a net metering policy scenario, and then the other, it sounds like there was pretty good interest in the other scenarios, including technology cost, ITC, and focus incentives.
That's what I heard too. This is Mitch, but this is kind of the chance to make sure whatever assumptions that should go into these scenarios are considered. Certainly, you can contact us at any time, but I just want to I want to come out of this meeting with knowing that you all have a good understanding of where the scenarios are going, next steps, if there's certain data or considerations that you would like to send along to help inform assumptions. You know, should the ITC be extended longer? Should the focus incentives be something other than 2% higher, 200% higher? Is there, you know, help guide? This is the opportunity to kind of help guide those next steps. So just want to encourage everyone to you know, speak up if you've got thoughts there.
Right. And I guess I misspoke. My email address isn't on here. It's actually Amalia's. My email is Jeremy.Eckstein, ECKSTEIN @cadmusgroup.com, or you can
I
email
also know where you
Amalia
live, so.
and she can forward them to me. And I imagine quite a few of us on the call, like you've probably already seen my email address and from other presentations, but please do reach out.
And I guess some of the point I was trying to make too is that this is a pretty, you know, short study period. We don't have a lot of time to deliberate on these things, because I think the final report is due in September, and you know, this is a complex modeling exercise where a lot goes into it, and we want to make sure we're representing the feedback that we're hearing appropriately, and the opportunities for those additional scenarios are, you know, represent the highest value that this study can deliver.
Mitch, it's Kathy. To build on that, I mean, early on it sounded like there could only be 4 scenarios, and now we're maybe saying there's interest in 5. I'm just wondering if, because at some level, increasing focus incentives or decreasing solar module costs or extending the tax credit, those are all about sort of tweaking the economics in various ways. And if I just, I mean, obviously there's something useful in understanding which of those have the biggest impacts. My own perspective is, of those, the one that's probably least useful is the impact of the federal tax credit extension, because that isn't something we control locally. So that information doesn't inform the commission process in quite the same way that the other levers do, but like installers on the line might have a really different perspective on that. I'm just concerned that you have to somehow, and maybe I'm wrong, that you have to narrow that back to 4 from 5.
Yeah, I apologize if it was understood that the number of scenarios is growing, but no, 4 is the limitation.
Agreed. So we would have to make a trade. And it's because, just for context, it takes about a day to run the commercial model. It's very data intensive. So there's just time constraints on running scenarios. Sorry, is there a hand up still?
Yeah, this is Tyler Huebner with the commission. So can you describe the technology cost one? I'm wondering if that's one that may be, at least in my head, lower priority compared to the 3 other ones that appear to me to be more policy driven on ITC, focus incentives, financing, and then technology cost are the 4 that I'm seeing. So what does that entail exactly, and how would it perhaps be different, or show different results? Essentially, it'd be lower costs as the years progress, and then we would see what impact that would have on uptake. Is that right?
That's exactly right.
And is there a way, if we didn't run a scenario specifically on that, that we could somehow impute the results? Because to me, that's the change in adoption would be just similar to a higher incentive would be the same as, technology cost lowering to the end consumer, theoretically. So is there a way that if we take that one out, we could somehow impute that, hey, if costs go down 10 or 20 or 30%, here's what that may or may not do to adoption. Whereas I think the policy net metering variable of anything from going away up to Kathy's suggestion of 500 kilowatts, if there was ways to kind of see a slider bar of that may be something that is much more complex to analyze in my head. So that's what I'm thinking about as a trade-off there, just me personally.
Yeah, I think you could impute essentially the changes in the how important upfront costs are, because the most of the interest was in the capital cost. So yes, I agree with you. I think you could make some inference based on upfront incentives.
Or
And
that may be
sorry,
one.
go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, and just a final note on that as we kind of think about this, and Mitch guides everyone, that this specific one of technology costs may be one that's somewhat studied either nationally or in other states. You know, the impact of technology cost declines on suspected market uptake. I don't know if that's true, but you know, Wisconsin net metering changes. That's one that nobody else had will have done. So that may lend itself to being something that this study would be able to uniquely accomplish. So, okay, I'm just thinking. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that, you know, in speaking with NREL, they frequently they say that this is a frequent adjustment that they make in their model. I'm not sure that I've seen a published study, but I think we may be able to find one that looks at technology costs. The ITC scenario is definitely one that I've seen other papers on, not Wisconsin specific, but in terms of, you know, I think on a national level, that effect has been studied in using this model as well. Sam, I think you have your hand up.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to kind of piggyback on what Tyler said regarding the technology cost scenario, just because we found that, you know, most of the project cost declines, we've kind of squeezed all of the juice, so to speak, that we can, it sounds like, from this fruit. So I just, you know, I would rather see, you know, a different scenario, like one of the ones that maybe Kathy or some of the other folks talked about instead, because from what our solar installers have been telling us is that, you know, the proportion of soft cost to equipment cost continues to rise. So I just don't see that, you know, that scenario would be as useful to us as some of the other potential ones.
Understand.
Yeah, this is all really great feedback. So exactly what I was hoping to get out of this meeting. I guess I hate to put folks on the spot, but I mean, from a program administrator standpoint, does anybody with Aptum have any thoughts on value of particular scenarios or inputs that they've heard? I mean, if you don't feel, that's okay. I just wanted to see if that perspective was out there.
Yeah, this is Scott Bladorn. I mean, you know, Mitch, you and I and Jeremy, we spoke last week, I think, about some of this, and obviously we want to know what the effect of the incentives is, and I think we can crank those up, you know, for the purpose of this analysis, like double it, triple it, quadruple it, see what, you know, and see what happens. That'll be really helpful, especially when you take out the ITC. I think that's probably the most interesting thing for us, you know, because we're kind of following the ITC right now. We're a secondary, you know, market driver compared to that. But if that does go away in, you know, a couple of years, then our incentives will be much more important. So that's really important for us. And I think I can agree with what Commissioner Hubner and Sam both echoed, with that maybe the technology cost is not as important, because it seems like it has fallen off, and it is, I mean, we actually saw a slight increase in residential install costs over the last couple of years. So we've kind of maybe gotten to the bottom of the technology cost, and now it's more market driven, and labor, and, you know, all the soft costs involved in there. So yeah, I'll leave it at that, but would love to see what increasing those incentives will do in this model.
Great.
Mitch, this is Scott Blankman. Given the conversations here and seeking alignment on the scenarios, could you just summarize then what we think the 4 scenarios are that we've ultimately landed on?
I think that's a great idea. So let's, so if somebody jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, if I got any of this incorrect. So one scenario would be to look at a significant increase to the focus on energy incentives. I don't think we landed on a particular number, but it sounded like maybe a 200% increase was reasonable, if not low. Okay. So another that I heard was maybe 2 scenarios around on net metering. One would be Kathy's suggestion regarding capacity limit, setting that higher. I believe Kathy, you threw out the number of 500 kW. So that's on the list, and that would kind of get the high end, removing constraints, look at things. I believe the other side of that was to kind of go the opposite, and I'm not sure if I totally got what the sentiment was there to sort of bookend that input. Jeremy, did you have a good understanding?
Well, what I had heard was to make the entire state kind of a net metering policy. That's certainly one idea that was included. And so, you know, what we might want to consider is combining that with the capacity increase, and having a single net metering scenario, so that we leave room for some additional ones.
That's fair.
Yeah, that was certainly my intent, that was combined into one scenario.
And then I think I heard an ITC extension and technology cost were kind of not so important and should be something else considered there.
Hey guys, this is Mike from HGA again. So in my comments, what I was getting at was, you know, there's some tariffs out there, like Alliant has some, for their PG tariffs, they have a capacity value. It's like, I don't know, 1/10 of a penny or something, and that's valued based off that MISO PRA. So what I'm talking about is looking at that change in that that capacity value from PRA to cone. So it's quite significant. You know, that's the 3.5 cents just for the capacity value. So that's kind of what I was driving at. It's a little different than net metering. It's more of a buyback rate, you know, based on utility costs. So it's kind of in the weeds, but it's quite significant. And I don't know how you guys want to frame that in the scenarios, but I think it would be super valuable because it helps to bookend some of the deployment of solar based on how these tariffs get changed and evolve over time.
I think I understand, and so we can see, you know, if what we can do within the constraints of how the model is set up. There's some ability to customize the buyback rates, but before, you know, I promise what's actually doable, we'll need to circle back and see about making these adjustments. It's fairly complex.
Sure. I think big picture, you know, that the studies should help bookend the possibilities. And if we focus too much on the scenarios as they exist right now, it doesn't really provide as much value as if it looks at a wider scale of what could be and what the possibilities are, I guess.
Got it. So we talked about so it sounded like we want some kind of net metering scenario. We want a focus incentive scenario. The tax credits, not so much interest. Technology costs, not so much interest. And then, you know, we had proposed a financing scenario. We didn't hear anything about that, so I think that means there's interest in it. So I think that now leaves 3, assuming that we don't want to go ahead with the technology cost or investment tax credit scenario. There's still room for another one.
This is Tyler. I'll just jump in and say I think that Scott Bladorn made a really good point, though, about that I think we'll have to take offline and think about if some others have suggestions of a 4th one, that's great. But his point was related to the interplay between the value of the tax credit and focus on incentives, and specifically, you know, in out years. Is this potential study looking at 12 years like the efficiency one is?
That's right.
Okay. Yeah, so I think that is just in my mind that interplay is important, at least as a possible 4th scenario. And I would also think that the financing one is a good one. I think, you know, there's legal and policy questions about leasing or those kind of things, but this, in my head, would at least get you some inkling of whether it's home equity lines of credit or some other financing scenario. You would have a sense of how the potential would change with that policy change, not sort of dictating or saying what that policy change would be, but, you know, what would change as far as solar deployment if such a tool, something like that, was on the table. So I think that is a relevant one. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Got it. So so our next step slide was regarding our next meeting, but I think now this includes coming back to the group with our 4 proposed scenarios in the coming weeks. And otherwise we'll look forward to presenting draft results. In the meantime, if there's any other data or input that folks want to share with us regarding all aspects of the presentation, again, we welcome that, including stakeholders that are recommended to talk to, and any data. Please pass it along. I shared my email address earlier, or send it to Amalia. And I think that concludes our presentation, unless there's any further comments or feedback.
So Jeremy, are you thinking of like a meeting, a webinar type meeting to follow up, or email? What are you proposing?
I would think by email, Mitch.
Okay, that's what I thought, but I just wanted to make sure.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. This was really great.
Yep, thank you, everybody.
Very, very helpful for us.
Bye.
And nice job. Good meeting. Thank you.
Yeah, great job, guys. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.